Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the ruins of an ancient temple, where the stones still seem to breathe with stories. Imagine standing barefoot on cracked marble, the scent of old smoke lingering in the air, and the hush of history pressing in from every side. You tilt your head and swear you hear faint warnings carried by the dust, cautions about gods whose names feel strange on your tongue. Baal, Asherah, Moloch, they sound like characters out of a heavy metal playlist, but in reality, they were worshipped right here, in ways that made even the most jaded locals shiver. And before you think this is just a history lecture, nope, you're in the front row of an ancient drama. And honestly, if you had lived back then, you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where you're tuning in from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first step you take inside these temple ruins sends up a puff of dust, and suddenly you're in Jerusalem, long after the grandeur of Solomon's first temple had faded. The walls echo with footsteps that aren't yours, priests in white linen hurrying past, kings pacing nervously, prophets bellowing warnings while being ignored. The book of 2 Chronicles leans heavily on this very setting, painting the temple not just as a building but as the beating heart of faith. And what happens when that heart clogs with idols? Well, the chronicler says you end up gasping for spiritual air. You notice scorch marks on the stones, blackened patches that once drank the smoke of offerings. Some were pure, lifted to Yahweh. Others, though, twisted the meaning, gifts laid at altars for imported gods. Historical records hint that Israelites weren't always picky about who got the barbecue smoke. Baal was a popular invite. Asherah had her corner. Moloch? Well, you didn't want to peek at his rituals after dark. One mainstream fact here. Solomon's temple was completed around 957 BCE, and for centuries it was considered the sacred dwelling of God's name on earth. Yet even in its prime, people tried to sneak in alternative deities. Historians still argue whether those abominations mentioned in Chronicles were widespread cultural practice or occasional lapses exaggerated by zealous scribes. Either way, you can imagine the tension. One priest solemnly lighting incense to Yahweh while, just outside, someone else sets up a pole for Asherah. And here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists once found little female figurines in ordinary homes across Judah. Not golden idols, not massive statues, just hand-sized clay pieces that look like someone's grandmother made them during pottery class. Scholars think these were linked to Asherah devotion, tucked onto shelves like spiritual knickknacks. Picture your neighbor today putting a lucky cat on the counter, except in this case, the Bible writers considered it spiritual sabotage. As you wander through the ruins, you run your fingers across graffiti carved into the wall. Not modern graffiti, mind you, ancient scratches, prayers to different gods layered one over another. Imagine the temple guards just shaking their heads, muttering, "Great, another kid with a chisel thinks Baal's gonna pay the rent." The chronicler viewed such mixing as disaster in slow motion, a drift so subtle people hardly noticed until crisis hit. You pause, closing your eyes. The temple floor vibrates with echoes of national pride, of music and sacrifices, of pilgrims coming from every direction to seek blessing. Yet the chronicler isn't writing to celebrate. He's writing to warn. His voice through time says, "Look what happens when you trade faithfulness for convenience." That hits harder than any crumbling stone, and right here, the chronicler has a method. He's not inventing new tales. He's retelling stories from Samuel and Kings, but turning the camera so you see things through Judah's lens. Why Judah? Because after exile, that little tribe needed answers. Why had their holy city burned? Why did Babylon drag them away in chains? The chronicler's reply, it wasn't because God was weak. It was because the people flirted with Baal, bowed to Asherah, and even tried the fiery arms of Moloch. That's like cheating on your spouse, burning the family photos, and then wondering why the marriage didn't last. The air grows heavier as you imagine families dragging animals toward the altar, some singing psalms, others whispering foreign chants. You see a king, take Ahaz, for example, copying pagan practices after seeing them in Damascus, installing his own fashionable altar right in Yahweh's temple. Imagine swapping out the fridge in your kitchen for your neighbor's because you thought their appliance looked trendier. Except here, the replacement was spiritual, not cosmetic. The chronicler points a tired finger at all of it. He wants you, sitting here in the ruins, to feel the weight. This isn't about dusty theology. It's about choosing between life-giving devotion and hollow imitation. And maybe the funniest part, if you can call it that, is realizing how human the whole mess was. People got bored. They wanted novelty. Yahweh was invisible, demanding, sometimes slow to deliver rain. Baal had cool myths about storms and lightning. Asherah promised fertility, and let's be honest, that marketing always sells. Moloch gave the illusion of control, terrifying but seductive. The chronicler basically says, look, you traded the creator for cheap knockoffs. You lean against a pillar and listen again. The whispers aren't just warning about ancient idols. They're nudging you to notice your own. That phone buzzing on your nightstand, the endless scroll, the craving for likes, it's not Baal or Asherah, but it sure smells like distraction. And if the chronicler were here, he'd probably raise an eyebrow and scribble a quick side note. Yep, still happening. The ruins settle into silence as you realize the story isn't done. The chronicler's temple isn't just memory, it's the stage for every king, prophet, priest, and wandering citizen who'll pass through this journey. And each of them will wrestle with the same warning: don't give your heart to false gods, no matter how shiny, trendy, or terrifying they seem. You step carefully over the cracked pavement, and the stones almost feel alive under your feet, humming with memories. The whispers shift now, carrying you back even further, before the chronicler sharpened his quill, before Judah's kings came and went. You land in the desert heat of Israel's earliest days, where the people seemed to have an on-again, off-again relationship with Yahweh, like a teenager swearing devotion one day and sneaking out to see someone else the next. Take the golden calf incident. You know the one. Fresh out of Egypt, the Israelites had just witnessed seas parting, plagues hammering Pharaoh, and manna literally falling from the sky. And yet, the moment Moses takes a little too long up the mountain, they panic and commission a flashy calf statue. That's like quitting your job and blowing your savings on a pyramid scheme the very next week. It's almost laughable, except it sets the tone for centuries of idle chases. The chronicler looks back at these stories and shakes his head, saying, see? It's been happening forever. The golden calf wasn't just a slip-up. It was the prototype of replacing Yahweh with glitter. The Israelites didn't say, "Forget God." They said, "Let's worship this alongside him." That sneaky both/and mentality kept reappearing, and the chronicler calls it out like a parent who knows exactly when you're sneaking cookies before dinner. Is a mainstream fact. Jeroboam, the very first king of the northern kingdom after the split, deliberately set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan. Not because he was clueless, but because he wanted political convenience. If people kept traveling south to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, his fragile kingdom would lose loyalty. So he thought, I'll give them some shiny alternatives closer to home. Historians still argue whether Jeroboam believed these calves represented Yahweh or entirely different gods, but either way, it fractured worship for good. As you walk through this memory, you can almost hear the bells of priests in Jerusalem ringing angrily, while up north, worshippers cheer in front of golden statues. It's not just a theological debate, it's the sound of a nation split right down the middle, both politically and spiritually. And here's a quirky tidbit you probably didn't hear in Sunday school. Some scholars think Jeroboam's calves were inspired by Egyptian iconography, where gods often stood on the backs of bulls. Imagine importing design ideas like someone scrolling Pinterest for divine decor. Except this wasn't about style, it was about security. Jeroboam thought he was stabilizing his kingdom, but instead, he opened the floodgates for generations of idol confusion. Now, fast forward a bit. That same craving for something extra trickled down into Judah, where kings copied the fashion of their neighbors. The chronicler watches this play out and frames it as a slow-motion car crash, altar smoke meant for Yahweh getting diverted, animals slaughtered for idols, and songs of worship competing with chants for fertility gods. If you've ever tried to play 2 YouTube videos at once, you know the chaos, except here, the cost was a kingdom's soul. Picture this scene, a villager trudging up to Jerusalem with a lamb for sacrifice, only to pass another villager on the road lugging a little figurine for home worship. Both smile politely, maybe even share bread, but deep down they're walking in opposite directions spiritually. The chronicler leans over your shoulder and whispers, "This is why the temple fell." But the story isn't just tragedy, it's loaded with irony. Time and again, the people cry to Yahweh when things go wrong, plagues, droughts, invading armies, and time and again, as soon as relief comes, they wander back to idols. It's spiritual whiplash. You almost want to chuckle, because it's the same thing you catch yourself doing, promising to change when life's hard, then sliding back into old habits once the pressure lifts. The chronicler, though, isn't laughing. He's warning. There's a mainstream scholarly debate that pops up here too. Were the people really that unfaithful? Or is the chronicler using heavy exaggeration to drive home his moral point? Some argue archaeological finds, like those household figurines, show that idol practices were common and ingrained. Others think the chronicler painted the whole society with too broad a brush, blaming the masses for what may have been elite or royal-level corruption. Either way, the narrative comes across as clear as those ruined temple walls. The people kept swapping out Yahweh for other gods, and each swap had consequences. You wander deeper into the memory, and suddenly the air thickens with smoke. Altars blaze not just with lambs but with bulls, incense, even grain offerings. Priests mutter, kings parade, and the crowd cheers for whichever god seems most likely to answer their immediate need. Rain, Baal. Babies, Asherah. Safety in battle, Moloch, terrifying as he was. Yahweh became part of the lineup instead of the only name on the ticket, like having a phone with 10 different chargers plugged into it at once. You're not actually charging faster, you're just asking for sparks and fire. The chronicler writes with this tone of exhausted sarcasm, as if to say, really? You thought that would work? And the most haunting part? The people didn't think they were abandoning Yahweh. They thought they were hedging bets. Adding extra gods into the mix felt like a clever life hack. But in the chronicler's lens, that hack was a virus, corrupting the very core of the covenant. The ruins around you groan as if agreeing. You glance back at Solomon's temple stones and realize that from golden calves to blazing altars, the problem was always the same: distraction dressed up as devotion. And here in this long shadow, the chronicler keeps pointing. See the pattern. Don't repeat it. You shuffle forward, the air suddenly shifting from the scent of smoldering sacrifice to the damp promise of rain. Overhead, thunder rolls, and you almost expect lightning to split the sky. This is Baal's territory now, the storm god, the cloud rider, the one who swaggered into Israelite imaginations promising to deliver rain and fertility. And let's be honest, in an agrarian world where your life depends on crops, rain was the original Wi-Fi. Lose it, and everything crashes. The chronicler's warning echoes here. Baal might have looked like the perfect provider, but devotion to him was a slippery slope. Farmers saw lightning and thought, clearly this guy's got power. After all, Baal myths from Canaan told stories of him wrestling with the sea god Yam, building a fancy palace, and sending showers to bless the earth. To a struggling Israelite farmer, it was marketing genius. Worship Baal, guarantee your harvest. Who wouldn't be tempted? Here's a mainstream fact. Ugaritic texts discovered in Ras Shamra, modern Syria, in the 20th century describe Baal as the god of storms and fertility, central to Canaanite religion. These texts lined up eerily well with biblical accounts of Israel's flirtation with Baal. Historians still argue whether Israelite Baal worship was a wholesale adoption of Canaanite rituals or a watered-down version adapted into Yahweh's framework. Either way, the chronicler treats it like poison, no matter how diluted, and for a quirky tidbit, Baal was sometimes depicted holding a club in one hand and a bolt of lightning in the other, basically the ancient equivalent of Thor's cosplay. Except instead of Marvel movies, his PR campaign played out in rainstorms. Imagine villagers staring at a thunderhead, whispering, "Yep, Baal's flexing again," while prophets in the corner roll their eyes, saying, "Nope, that's Yahweh's sky." You picture the daily life, a farmer kneeling in freshly tilled soil, whispering prayers not to the god of Sinai but to Baal, hoping his wheat survives the season. The chronicler sees this as betrayal wrapped in desperation. It's not that the farmers hated Yahweh, it's that Baal looked like a more practical option. In their minds, Yahweh was cosmic CEO, far away, while Baal was the local rain guy. But the prophets? They weren't having it. Elijah, for example, staged one of the most dramatic smackdowns in history, daring Baal's prophets on Mount Carmel to call down fire from heaven. Spoiler, Baal ghosted them. Yahweh, on the other hand, showed up with a blaze so hot it licked the water off the altar. And yet, even after that pyrotechnic sermon, the people kept sneaking back to Baal. It's like watching someone see the world's greatest magic trick and still asking the birthday clown to do balloon animals. The chronicler doesn't retell Elijah's story directly, that's found in Kings, but his silence still buzzes with the same judgment. Trusting Baal is short-term thinking with long-term fallout. The chronicler's Judah had seen famine, invasion, and exile. They knew what it felt like to put trust in the wrong forecast. Here's the funny angle. Baal worship included rituals that, to us, sound like a mix of awkward theater and bad reality TV. Scholars suggest some rites involved simulated acts of fertility to encourage the land to bear crops. Whether that's exaggerated or not, imagine attending a neighborhood festival where things suddenly get a little too personal, and the prophets are in the corner muttering, "This is exactly why God sent us warnings." And that's the open scholarly debate worth pausing on. Did Baal worship in Israel actually involve fertility rituals, or is that a later caricature painted by biblical writers to make the cult sound extra scandalous? Archaeologists have found symbols, like standing stones and bull imagery, that hint at fertility themes, but the evidence is patchy. Historians still argue whether these rituals were earthy metaphors or literal practices that would have made your grandma faint. Meanwhile, thunder keeps echoing over your head as you imagine Judah's kings making political calculations. If a neighboring nation prospered under Baal, wouldn't it make sense to import his rituals? Rain doesn't respect borders, after all. That's how rulers like Ahab and even some of Judah's monarchs justified it. We're not betraying Yahweh, we're just expanding the weather insurance plan. The chronicler, though, throws sarcasm their way. And how'd that work out for you? Oh right, exile. You step into a half-collapsed courtyard and imagine the tension. One family prays at the temple in the morning, offering sacrifices to Yahweh, then heads home in the evening to join neighbors chanting for Baal under the stars. It's a spiritual double life. The chronicler writes as if shaking his head, saying, "Pick one. You can't water 2 fields with 1 bucket." And maybe that's the most relatable sting. Baal wasn't pitched as rebellion but as practicality. That's why it worked. Who wouldn't want a quick rain guarantee in a drought? It's the same impulse that makes you reach for shortcuts today, whether it's diet pills over discipline or clickbait advice instead of patient effort. Baal was the original shortcut. The chronicler's narrative warns, shortcuts don't save kingdoms. Lightning flashes across the ruins in your imagination, illuminating carved stones and forgotten altars. For a second, you almost see Baal's shadow towering with his thunderbolt, and then, poof, it's gone, nothing but storm clouds dispersing. The chronicler whispers through the silence, "This is why the temple cracked. This is why Judah fell." And you exhale, realizing you're still standing in the rubble, rainless sky above, haunted by the storm god who promised so much and delivered nothing lasting. Your steps crunch over broken stone as the storm cloud echoes fade, replaced by the rustle of leaves. You find yourself walking through groves, the air heavy with the scent of resin and wood smoke. Here, the figure of Asherah hovers, queenly, maternal, mysterious. She isn't a thunder god with lightning props. She's subtler, showing up in carved poles, leafy sanctuaries, and little figurines tucked discreetly into households. Where Baal was loud and brash, Asherah slid into Israelite life almost unnoticed, like ivy slowly climbing a wall until the bricks vanished beneath green. the chronicler whispers warnings about her influence, but you can feel why people were drawn to her. In a world where childbirth was dangerous, crops fragile, and survival always uncertain, the idea of a motherly goddess promising fertility and protection was irresistible. And unlike Moloch's terrifying flames, Asherah felt approachable: soft edges, carved wood, groves where people gathered under moonlight. Here's a mainstream fact: the Hebrew Bible frequently condemns Asherah poles, sacred wooden symbols set up on high places or even near Yahweh's altars. Archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions from Kuntalat Adrud in the Sinai desert that reference Yahweh and his Asherah. Historians still argue whether this means some Israelites thought Asherah was Yahweh's divine consort or whether Asherah was just shorthand for a cultic object. Either way, the chronicler bristles at the idea of pairing God with a goddess. And here's your quirky tidbit: some of those Asherah figurines were made with exaggerated features, think bobbleheads meets folk art, possibly to emphasize fertility. Picture stumbling across one in your grandma's attic. Not creepy exactly, but definitely not something you'd want on the mantle. They weren't gold or glamorous, they looked homemade, almost cozy, which probably made them all the more dangerous. People thought of them as little blessings, not threats. You push deeper into the grove, and the trees lean in like gossiping neighbors. You can almost hear the laughter of villagers gathering under Asherah poles, pouring out prayers for children, rain, or protection. It's easy to see why it appealed. There's community, music, maybe even food stalls. Compared to the solemn, rule-heavy rituals at the temple, Asherah worship probably felt like a festival. And humans love festivals, but the chronicler writes with sharp edges here, showing how compromise crept into Judah's heart. He doesn't just say, "Oh, they worshipped Asherah." He highlights how kings actually planted her poles inside Yahweh's temple courts. That's like renting out a corner of your church foyer for a psychic's booth: jarring, inappropriate, and yet somehow tolerated. For the chronicler, that kind of blending was worse than outright rebellion. It was betrayal under the banner of devotion. And this is where the open scholarly debate crackles. Was Asherah really worshipped alongside Yahweh? Or was her cult a separate thing that only infiltrated in pockets? Some say the inscriptions show syncretism. Ordinary Israelites believed God had a heavenly partner. Others argue the chronicler and other biblical writers were exaggerating the problem to make a theological point. The evidence is messy, scattered like shards of pottery across a dig site. Still, the chronicler's message is clear: blending Yahweh with Asherah wasn't harmless. It rewrote the very identity of faith. He frames Judah's history as a tug-of-war between kings who smashed Asherah poles and kings who raised them back up. It reads like a soap opera of reform and relapse. Hezekiah cuts them down, cheers. Manasseh plants them again, groans. Josiah burns them, hope. And through it all, the chronicler sighs, reminding you that the people never fully let go. You sit under one of these imagined poles for a moment, the wood creaking above you, and think about the psychology of it. Worshipping Asherah wasn't about rejecting Yahweh, it was about wanting both. It's like keeping two calendars and hoping they'll line up. But sooner or later, the schedules collide, and one has to give. For Judah, the price of divided worship was exile. Here's the lighter note. Imagine an ancient Israelite child asking their mom, "Why do we have two gods in the living room?" That awkward pause must have been real. Parents probably shrugged it off, "Oh, sweetie, it's just tradition." And isn't that how compromise usually sneaks in? Not through big choices, but through little decorations that nobody questions. The chronicler leans in here, almost with sarcasm, saying, "You thought planting a pole in the temple yard would guarantee babies and barley? All it did was guarantee Babylon knocking at your gate." His voice is weary but sharp, reminding you how small compromises add up to monumental collapse. You stand, brushing dirt off your hands, and look around the grove. The Asherah poles loom like skeletal trees, their carvings half worn by weather but still hinting at the devotion poured into them. You realize how seductive they must have been, tangible, visible, even beautiful. Compared to Yahweh's invisible, untouchable presence, Asherah seemed easier to reach. But the chronicler's ruins prove that easy isn't always safe. As the wind sighs through the trees, you take one last glance at the carved wood and whisper to yourself, "This is why 2 Chronicles warns." Then you step out of the grove, leaving the poles behind, though their shadows follow you into the next ruin. Your sandals scrape against a path darkened with ash, and the air suddenly sharpens, hot and metallic, like the taste of iron on your tongue. Ahead, you see a massive bronze figure, arms outstretched, glowing faintly red from the fire raging beneath. This is no cozy Asherah pole or festival grove. This is Moloch's domain, and the heat presses against your skin like a furnace door flung wide. You can almost hear the crackling of flames, the pounding drums meant to drown out the cries. And the chronicler's whisper here is colder than the fire is hot. This is the lowest a people can go when they trade Yahweh for idols. Moloch worship, at least as remembered in biblical texts, was terrifying. Where Baal promised rain and Asherah promised fertility, Moloch demanded your children. His rites, whether exaggerated by horrified chroniclers or practiced in full, stand as a nightmarish image of devotion gone wrong. The Valley of Hinnom, just outside Jerusalem, was infamous for these rituals, its smoke curling into the city like a warning nobody wanted to smell. Here's a mainstream fact. Biblical passages like 2 Chronicles 28 verse 3 and 33:6 describe kings of Judah, such as Ahaz and Manasseh, passing their sons through the fire in the valley. Historians still argue whether this meant literal child sacrifice or some form of symbolic rite. But either way, the chronicler treats it as abomination number 1, the darkest betrayal of covenant loyalty, and the quirky tidbit. Some ancient sources outside the Bible describe Moloch as a hollow bronze statue heated from within, arms extended like a cradle. Worshippers supposedly placed offerings, or, chillingly, children, into those blazing arms. Whether that's myth, exaggeration, or grim fact is debated, but the image stuck. It's the kind of story that gets told around campfires for centuries, half warning, half horror tale. You almost want to shiver, except the fire in front of you is too hot for that. The chronicler emphasizes how kings who allowed this weren't just dabbling in foreign worship, they were sabotaging their own lineage. Imagine the irony, a king sacrificing his heir to win military favor. That's like burning your car to save on gas money. It doesn't make sense, but fear has a way of twisting logic. You picture Ahaz, desperate for protection against stronger neighbors, sneaking into Hinnom's valley, pretending he's making a bold political move while prophets tear their garments in grief. And later, Manasseh, whose reign was basically a how-not-to-do-it manual, dragging Judah into chaos by sanctioning every idol he could find, including Moloch's fire. For the chronicler, these kings weren't just weak, they were cautionary tales, their reigns written as if in flames. Here's the open scholarly debate. Some argue child sacrifice to Moloch was never as widespread in Judah as biblical texts suggest. Archaeological evidence is thin, and some scholars think the chronicler exaggerated to shock readers into moral clarity. Others point to Phoenician and Carthaginian practices, where cremated remains of children have been found, as proof that the cult of Moloch was real, horrifying, and possibly imported into Judah. The lack of consensus keeps the fire flickering in modern scholarship, but whether widespread or not, the chronicler wants you to feel the weight. This wasn't just a bad religious choice, it was the ultimate inversion of everything Israel's covenant stood for. Where Yahweh asked for trust and loyalty, Moloch demanded terror and loss. The chronicler positions Moloch as the clearest example of what happens when worship slides from life-giving to life-destroying. You take a step closer, and the drums pound louder, shaking the air like a war march. Villagers gather, their faces lit by fire, some eager, others pale with dread. You can almost hear a mother whispering to herself, "Maybe this will bring protection," even as her heart cracks. It's unbearable, and you pull back, realizing that the chronicler wrote this to make future generations recoil just as strongly. But here's the twisted humor of human nature. People still convinced themselves this was logical. Maybe it was peer pressure, maybe superstition, maybe raw desperation. Either way, they dressed horror up as holiness. It's not so different from modern folks who sacrifice health, family, or sanity for success, prestige, or attention. Moloch's arms may not glow in your city, but his shadow still stretches into boardrooms, phone screens, and overworked calendars. The chronicler's warning lingers. Idols consume more than you expect. The firelight flickers against the ruined stones around you, and you swear the bronze figure shifts, grinning through the heat. But when you blink, it's gone, just a shadow on broken walls. The valley is quiet now, haunted, the ground soaked with stories too heavy to retell. You wipe sweat from your brow, your throat dry as ash, and step away from Moloch's fire. The chronicler's whisper follows. This is what happens when the people forget whose children they are. And with that, the flames fade, leaving only the faint crackle of memory. The firelight from Moloch's arms fades behind you, and now you find yourself in a long hallway of stone, the air cooler but thick with tension. Shadows of kings pace here, men in royal robes, crowns tilting with worry, sandals slapping the floor as they wrestle with impossible choices. Judah's rulers, one after another, stumbled between loyalty to Yahweh and flings with idols. And the chronicler's voice cuts through like a tired teacher repeating the same lesson. See? This is what happens when leaders can't decide who they serve. You glance to your left, and there's King Rehoboam, Solomon's son, nervously clutching his scepter. Early in his reign, he listened to bad advice, split the kingdom, and before long, idols crept into Judah like weeds through cracked pavement. The chronicler says Rehoboam let Asherah poles flourish and shrines multiply. Imagine inheriting the most glorious kingdom on earth and then accidentally turning it into a spiritual yard sale. Not exactly the resume you'd want carved on your tomb. Mainstream fact. The chronicler names at least 5 kings of Judah: Rehoboam, Ahaz, Manasseh, Amon, and Jehoram, who openly endorsed idol worship. Some copied neighbors, some built high places, some even closed Yahweh's temple doors. Historians still argue whether the chronicler exaggerated their failures to prove his point, but the pattern of reform and relapse shows up across biblical texts. And here's your quirky tidbit. One inscription found near Lachish suggests that during Hezekiah's time, one of the good kings, people scribbled prayers on pottery shards asking for protection, kind of like ancient sticky notes. It's a reminder that while kings swung between devotion and idolatry, ordinary folks were scribbling prayers wherever they could. The spiritual climate wasn't just shaped at the palace, it trickled into kitchens, fields, and guard posts. You move forward, and suddenly King Jehoshaphat strides past, one of Judah's more faithful rulers. He tried to tear down idols, reform courts, and promote Yahweh worship. But even he had a weakness for political alliances. His friendship with Israel's idol-friendly King Ahab nearly cost him his life in battle. The chronicler records this with a raised eyebrow. Great guy, but terrible at picking friends. You can almost hear him mutter, if your buddy keeps inviting you to Baal festivals, maybe get new buddies. Next comes King Ahaz, and you almost flinch at his reputation. He's the one who not only sacrificed to Moloch but also shut Yahweh's temple altogether. Picture boarding up the doors, dust piling on the altar, priests pacing outside with nothing to do. Instead of repairing the temple, he built shrines on every corner of Jerusalem. It was like replacing your Wi-Fi with a bunch of tin cans and string, hoping it works better. Spoiler, it didn't. The chronicler doesn't just list these kings. He contrasts them, one faithful ruler after another corrupt one, like a pendulum swinging wildly. Uzziah sought Yahweh, but later grew proud and messed up in the temple. Jotham stayed steady, then his son Ahaz crashed Judah into spiritual debt. Hezekiah reformed everything, then Manasseh undid it all spectacularly. It's exhausting to read, and that's exactly the point. Spiritual inconsistency drains nations dry. Here's the open scholarly debate. Were these kings genuinely as fickle as the chronicler paints them, or is he simplifying history into neat categories? Good king, bad king, to drive home a lesson? Archaeologists dig up evidence of shrines and figurines even in times when the chronicler claims idols were destroyed. That suggests reality was messy. Perhaps even during reforms, some idol worship quietly lingered in homes. You lean against a cracked wall, and the images of kings flicker past like a slideshow. Each one represents a choice, loyalty or compromise, Yahweh or idols, courage or fear. The chronicler wants you to feel how fragile leadership is. A king's decision wasn't private, it shaped the entire nation's destiny. When they turned to idols, the people followed. When they smashed shrines, revival surged. It was a high-stakes game of follow the leader, and too often the leader wandered off into the weeds. You smirk at one mental picture, a king nervously hiding an idol in the palace like someone sneaking junk food into a diet retreat. The prophets burst in, shouting, "We told you so," while the king mumbles excuses. The chronicler's tone carries that same sarcasm, as if he can't believe Judah's rulers kept falling for the same tricks. But the humor fades quickly, because you realize the chronicler is aiming at you too. Leaders stumble when they chase popularity over principle, when they lean on what looks practical instead of what's right. And if you've ever compromised on a conviction just to avoid conflict, you know exactly how these kings felt. The hallway grows colder as the kings vanish, leaving only echoing footsteps. The chronicler's whisper lingers, faithful kings brought life. Unfaithful ones led you here, to ruins. You glance around the cracked stones and realize that this hallway isn't just Judah's history, it's the trail of every leader who traded integrity for convenience. You leave behind the flickering shadows of kings, and the silence is shattered by voices, loud, insistent, and impossible to ignore. You've stepped into a crowded market square, and prophets are everywhere. Some stand on crates, waving their arms like street preachers. Others march through alleyways, calling out warnings over the clatter of pottery and the bleating of goats. The chronicler may not detail every prophet's speech, but you can feel their presence woven through the history, relentless messengers of Yahweh, shouting when nobody wanted to listen. You glance to your right, and Isaiah is there, booming about holiness and trust in God rather than political alliances. His voice is steady, but his eyes blaze like coals. Jeremiah is across the street, tear-streaked, almost begging the people to repent, his words like cracked pottery jars ready to break. And somewhere in the distance, Micah cries out against corruption in high places, his voice cutting through the hum of trade like a blade through cloth. Mainstream fact: prophets weren't just spiritual voices, they were political commentators, too. Isaiah lived during the threat of Assyria, Jeremiah during Babylon's rise, and their warnings weren't vague "be nice to each other" messages. They were urgent: abandon idols or face destruction. Historians still argue whether their public performances, like Jeremiah smashing jars or Isaiah walking barefoot, were literal street theater or symbolic stories told later. Either way, their passion echoes through every stone you pass. Here's a quirky tidbit: Jeremiah once wore an ox yoke around his neck to dramatize Judah's coming servitude to Babylon. Imagine walking through town with a giant farm tool clanking around your shoulders, people pointing and whispering, "That's the crazy prophet again." It was embarrassing, but unforgettable. Sometimes the most effective sermon is the one you can't unsee. The prophets shouted about many things: justice, mercy, humility, but their loudest refrain was always the same: stop worshiping idols. Over and over, they compared idol worship to adultery, calling Judah a faithless spouse sneaking around with other lovers. The chronicler echoes this in his history writing. The kings and people who flirted with Baal, Asherah, and Moloch weren't just making bad religious choices, they were betraying a covenant relationship. You imagine the scene: shoppers bartering for figs while Jeremiah interrupts with dire warnings about the temple's destruction. Someone rolls their eyes, muttering, "There he goes again, doom and gloom." Meanwhile, another vendor cheers at the sound of Baal's festival drums drifting from the hilltops. The prophets weren't popular, they were inconvenient, like alarms that wouldn't stop buzzing, and yet, you notice something striking: even when ignored, the prophets didn't stop. Their stubbornness is almost comical. Picture Isaiah lecturing in the square while kids tug on his robe, begging him to go home. Or Jeremiah, thrown into a cistern for being too depressing, still mumbling prophecies as he's hauled out. It's the ultimate lesson in persistence. Truth doesn't vanish just because people cover their ears. Here's the open scholarly debate: did the prophets have widespread audiences, or were they fringe voices recorded later by small groups of followers? Some argue they were national celebrities, known across the land. Others suggest their influence was limited, and only in hindsight did scribes elevate them into major figures. The chronicler himself doesn't quote them often, but his retellings reflect their spirit. Idol worship brings disaster, always you pause by a stall selling clay figurines, little Asherah statues for home blessings. A prophet marches by, shouting, "Those will be your downfall." The merchant huffs, muttering that prophets ruin business. It's a funny little moment, but it shows how deeply idol culture was embedded in daily life. For one person, it's income. For another, it's rebellion. For the prophet, it's an existential crisis. The chronicler's history feels like the prophet's voice carved into narrative form. Where the prophets yelled in the streets, the chronicler writes calmly but sharply, retelling the stories with the same punchline: they abandoned Yahweh, they fell. It's the same message, just delivered in bedtime story cadence rather than market square thunder, and maybe that's why prophets mattered so much. They kept interrupting comfort zones. They made people uncomfortable. They reminded the nation that faith wasn't about keeping traditions alive while sneaking off to idol festivals. It was about undivided loyalty. And even if everyone ignored them, their words outlasted palaces, armies, and idols. As the crowd in the market fades, you hear one last cry, softer but insistent: choose today whom you will serve. It's both a warning and an invitation, echoing into the ruins where you stand. The chronicler nods through the dust. The prophets were right, even when nobody wanted to hear them. The market square fades into silence, and now you find yourself slipping into the dim interior of a temple chamber. Candles flicker against the stone walls, casting long shadows that look suspiciously like both crosses and crooked branches. At first, you expect pure devotion to Yahweh here, priests in linen, incense curling upward like prayers, psalms rising in song. But then your eyes adjust, and you realize something is off. Right next to the altar are symbols that don't belong: carvings of suns and moons, little Asherah figures tucked in corners, maybe even a Baal emblem peeking through the incense haze. The chronicler's voice tightens here, almost like a parent scolding. Priests themselves weren't always the guardians of purity. Sometimes they were the ringleaders of compromise. Instead of smashing idols, they wove them into worship, hoping to keep everyone happy. A little Yahweh, a little Asherah, like mixing coffee with orange juice and insisting it's a balanced breakfast. Spoiler, it was not mainstream fact. Biblical accounts say priests sometimes endorsed high places, hilltop shrines where people sacrificed and worshipped idols. Even though these were often dedicated in the name of Yahweh, they blended pagan rituals, creating a religious smoothie of sorts. Historians still argue whether this syncretism was deliberate tolerance or just cultural laziness. Were priests thinking, "Hey, let's include everyone," or were they just giving in to what was popular? Here's your quirky tidbit. Archaeologists once found a Hebrew blessing inscribed on silver amulets from around the 7th century BCE, phrases similar to the priestly blessing in Numbers. That means priests were writing down benedictions on little wearable charms. Harmless, right? Except charms like that were often mixed with pagan protective magic. Imagine wearing a cross necklace that also doubles as a rabbit's foot. The line between faith and superstition blurred. You walk farther in, and the smell of incense changes. Instead of the rich spice blend commanded in the Torah, there's something sharper, maybe cedar, maybe resin used in local idol rituals. A priest swings a censer, smiling as if nothing is wrong, while behind him an Asherah pole stands tall like a decorative lamp. The chronicler doesn't spell out every detail, but his sigh is heavy. The very people meant to protect the covenant were watering it down. You can almost hear a sarcastic aside from the chronicler, because, sure, Yahweh really loves sharing his altar. It's the same tone you might use if someone added pineapple to your pizza uninvited. The mix looks harmless to outsiders, but to the covenant, it was betrayal. The priests of compromise weren't necessarily evil masterminds. They were practical. They wanted peace, unity, maybe even higher temple attendance. If including a fertility symbol kept farmers happy, why not? If a Moloch emblem kept foreign allies calm, what harm could it do? That's the slippery slope. Instead of bold devotion, it was cautious blending, and Judah's worship became a patchwork quilt with holes big enough to fall through. Here's the open scholarly debate. Some argue that the chronicler exaggerated priestly corruption to highlight reformers like Hezekiah and Josiah as heroes. Others suggest syncretism was so widespread that it would have been impossible to worship Yahweh without some crossover. After all, archaeologists keep finding household shrines that mix Yahweh's name with Asherah figurines. Maybe compromise wasn't the exception, it was the norm. You lean against a cracked pillar, and for a moment, you wonder if you'd have noticed back then. Would you see a carved pole in the temple and think, that's heresy? Or shrug and say, at least we're still singing psalms? That's the sneaky thing about compromise. It rarely looks dramatic. It just slips in quietly, like an uninvited guest at dinner, until one day you realize the whole meal tastes wrong. The chronicler paints reforming kings as dramatic temple cleaners for a reason. When Hezekiah reopens the temple or Josiah tears down idols, it isn't just political theater, it's a desperate attempt to reset worship to zero. To scrape away centuries of layered compromises. That's why Chronicles lingers on temple rituals, priests, and Levites. It's not just about history, it's about the heart of worship itself. One last image sticks with you as you leave the chamber. A priest holding a bowl of incense in one hand and an idol trinket in the other, trying to balance them like a juggler. His face is strained, his robe ash-stained, and you realize compromise doesn't satisfy either side. The idol worshippers laugh at it. Yahweh's covenant grieves it. And the chronicler shakes his head, warning you not to juggle what can't coexist. The temple chamber dissolves into mist, and suddenly you're strolling through a narrow neighborhood street. Clay houses lean against each other, smoke drifts from cooking fires, and children chase chickens through the dust. It looks ordinary, cozy even, until you notice the shelves inside those homes. Little clay figurines are everywhere, tucked in corners, sitting on ledges, even balanced on windowsills like knickknacks from a souvenir shop. Welcome to the everyday temptations the chronicler hints at, not grand ceremonies with fire and priests, but small household shrines where families hedge their bets. You peek through an open doorway. A woman kneads bread dough while a tiny Asherah figure watches from the shelf. She whispers a blessing under her breath, not abandoning Yahweh but adding a little insurance policy on the side. Across the alley, a soldier sharpens his sword, then touches a charm hanging from his belt, a carved sun disk, supposed to bring victory in battle. You realize the chronicler's frustration wasn't just with kings or priests, it was with ordinary folks like these, who couldn't resist keeping lucky charms. Mainstream fact: archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of these household idols in ancient Judah, especially female figurines with exaggerated features scholars call pillar figurines. Historians still argue whether they represented Asherah, a generic fertility goddess, or just some kind of symbolic charm. Either way, their sheer number suggests that idol use was part of daily domestic life, not just state cults. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some households even kept jars with inscriptions like belonging to Yahweh and his Asherah. Imagine labeling your coffee mug with both your name and your ex's, awkward and confusing. The phrase has fueled endless debates about whether some Israelites believed Yahweh actually had a divine consort. You keep walking, and the street grows busier. Vendors call out, selling amulets against the evil eye. A fisherman displays nets with little charms woven into the ropes, promising a better catch. A mother ties a red thread around her baby's wrist, swearing it will ward off illness. Everyday life is infused with superstition. To the people, it isn't rebellion, it's just practical. But the chronicler sees it differently. Every charm, every figurine, is a crack in the covenant wall. You pause to watch a child play with one of the little figurines, giggling as if it's just a doll. The irony isn't lost. You're looking at what might have been a sacred object for adults, reduced to a toy in tiny hands. And yet, the chronicler would still bristle. Because even if innocent, that figurine normalizes idolatry in the home. Faith isn't lost in grand moments of betrayal. It erodes slowly, through small, ordinary habits. Here's the open scholarly debate. Were these figurines acts of resistance against centralized worship in Jerusalem? Or were they simply folk religion coexisting with Yahweh's temple? Some scholars argue villagers clung to local practices because Jerusalem's temple was too distant or elite. Others say these figurines prove people never fully accepted monotheism until after exile. The chronicler, of course, doesn't care about nuance. To him, every figurine is rebellion. You imagine the chronicler muttering under his breath as he catalogues these homes. Oh look, another Asherah statue next to the bread oven. Because nothing says dinner like breaking the covenant. His sarcasm matches the frustration of prophets who shouted at kings. Only here, it's personal. Idolatry isn't some big political scandal. It's a neighbor hanging a charm in the doorway. It makes you wonder, if you lived here, would you resist? Or would you quietly keep a figurine in your kitchen just in case? After all, everyone else has one, and it's easier than standing out. That's the sting of everyday temptation. It hides in normalcy, making rebellion look harmless. The street narrows, and you see a final scene, a family gathered for dinner, heads bowed in prayer to Yahweh. On the shelf above them, a clay figurine stares blankly. Two devotions under one roof, like a spiritual split personality. You feel the chronicler's weariness. This isn't loyalty, it's divided love. And divided love always collapses. You scramble out of the Valley of Hinnom, lungs still smarting from phantom smoke. And now the landscape shifts into something strangely familiar, a kind of ancient fashion runway. Robes swish, jewelry glitters, people whisper about the latest cultural trends. But instead of debating whether shoulder pads are back in style, the crowd here argues whether worshipping idols is chic or shameful. The chronicler folds his arms in the corner, unimpressed. To him, this wasn't about style points. It was about eternal betrayal. You stroll along the runway, and villagers parade past with new spiritual accessories. One family brags about their fresh Asherah pole, hand-carved from imported cedar. Another proudly shows off a shiny Baal amulet dangling from their neck. It feels like a farmer's market meets a mall kiosk. Buy one fertility charm, Get a rain talisman half off. You can almost hear the chronicler muttering, "Oh yes," because nothing says sophisticated like bowing to a block of wood. Mainstream fact: in the ancient Near East, idol worship often carried cultural prestige. Fertility rituals were common among Canaanites, storm gods were revered by Phoenicians, and fire offerings cropped up in Ammon. Historians still argue whether Israelites adopted these practices because they believed in their power or because they wanted to fit in with their neighbors. Peer pressure isn't just a middle school problem, it was alive and well in Jerusalem's streets. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest Asherah poles may have doubled as giant decorated trees, festooned with ribbons, carvings, or even offerings. Imagine Judahites hosting an idol-themed block party where everyone gathers around a bedazzled tree. It's like ancient Pinterest meets religious rebellion. The deeper you walk into this scene, the clearer the split becomes. For some, idol worship was trendy, like wearing the latest imported sandals. Everyone's doing it, they'd argue. For others, especially prophets and reformers, it was the ultimate betrayal, like cheating on a spouse in broad daylight. The chronicler frames it as exactly that, not cultural fashion, but covenant-breaking adultery. Here's the open scholarly debate. Were idol rituals mostly shallow fads, practiced casually, or did people deeply believe they were encountering real deities? Some argue idols functioned like lucky charms, comforting but not central. Others believe worshippers experienced them as powerful spiritual encounters. The chronicler doesn't split hairs. To him, dabbling is betrayal. Whether it's trendy or devout, you stop near a pottery booth where a merchant displays bowls painted with suns, moons, and stars. Customers gush over their cosmic designs, proudly buying them as status symbols. You chuckle, it's like bragging about your astrology mug collection today. But for the chronicler, those bowls weren't harmless, they symbolized creeping compromise. Even kitchenware became a battleground for loyalty. It hits you then. The chronicler isn't just ranting about idols because he's grumpy. He knows that every fashion choice shapes the heart. Idolatry was more than bad theology, it was lifestyle branding. To the nations around Judah, idols were how you proved you were sophisticated, modern, connected. To resist them was to risk mockery or isolation. You imagine a Judahite teenager rolling their eyes at their parents. Why can't we have a cool Asherah pole like everyone else? Peer pressure echoes through every century. And the chronicler's voice sighs back, because cool doesn't equal faithful. One last image follows you as the runway fades. A villager struts proudly with an idol figurine under one arm, smiling like they've just bought the latest gadget. But as the crowd cheers, a prophet stands at the edge, hair wild, eyes blazing, shouting, "This isn't fashion, it's betrayal." The cheers drown him out, but the chronicler writes his words down anyway, so they outlive the applause. The palace garden fades, and now your feet crunch against loose gravel. You're standing at the edge of a deep ravine outside Jerusalem. The air is heavy with smoke, acrid and sour, carrying the unmistakable sting of something burned that should never have been set aflame. Locals whisper its name with unease, the Valley of Hinnom, later nicknamed Gehenna. The chronicler's warnings about idol worship suddenly feel tangible here, because this is where things spiraled into nightmare. You descend slowly, each step sliding on dusty rock. To your left, you notice broken clay jars, animal bones, and charred stones stacked into crude altars. To your right, hollow bronze statues gleam in the firelight, Moloch's arms stretched out like a grotesque welcome. Families once gathered here, not for picnics but for rituals no bedtime story should really include. And yet, the chronicler insists you know it happened, mainstream fact. Biblical texts record the Valley of Hinnom as a site where children were sacrificed to Moloch or Baal by fire. Historians still argue whether these sacrifices were widespread or symbolic slander against rival cults, but either way, the valley became a symbol of ultimate corruption. Later Jewish tradition even used Gehenna as shorthand for hell itself. Here's your quirky tidbit. Later in history, Hinnom was reportedly turned into a garbage dump, where refuse, dead animals, and sewage were burned continually. Imagine explaining to your kid, that valley used to be where people worshipped idols, and now it's where we throw out the fish guts. Talk about a downgrade. From horror show to landfill, you keep walking, and the smell thickens. You hear phantom cries, whether from memory, imagination, or echoes of history, you can't tell. Parents here once placed their children on blazing altars, believing sacrifice would guarantee prosperity, protection, or victory. The chronicler doesn't describe the gruesome details. He doesn't have to. Mentioning the valley is enough for readers to shudder. It represents the very bottom of idolatry's slippery slope. You pause at a jagged rock ledge, looking down into the smoky pit. The chronicler's sarcasm rings in your ears, because obviously, burning your own future generations is the best national policy. His dry tone masks deep sorrow. What began with household figurines ended here, in national disgrace and personal tragedy. Here's the open scholarly debate. Were these sacrifices actual state-sanctioned rituals, or rare, desperate acts during times of crisis? Some argue that kings like Ahaz and Manasseh officially endorsed them, while others believe only fringe groups participated. Either way, the chronicler holds Judah accountable. Even a handful of such acts was enough to poison the nation's legacy. The valley grows darker the deeper you wander. Flames flicker against stone walls, and the ground feels hot beneath your sandals. You remember the household figurines from earlier and realize, compromise doesn't stay small. It escalates. First a trinket in the kitchen, then a shrine in the palace, and finally, a child on the altar. That's the chronicler's chilling point. Idolatry isn't just silly, it's deadly. And yet, amid the smoke, you catch another detail. Carved into the rock face is graffiti, etched by trembling hands, Yahweh saves. Maybe a survivor, maybe a rebel prophet, maybe just someone refusing to let hope die. It's a fragile reminder that even in the valley of horror, someone remembered covenant promises. You smirk despite yourself, because you imagine some kid centuries later being told, "Don't play in Hinnom, it's cursed," and sneaking down anyway, daring friends to explore. Even the darkest places eventually become the stuff of dares and campfire stories. But for the chronicler, Hinnom isn't folklore. It's the warning label slapped on Judah's history. This is where idols lead. As you climb out of the ravine, lungs burning, you glance back one last time. The fires still glow, a grim backdrop against the stars. The chronicler whispers through the night air, "Remember this valley, because it's where betrayal takes you. And it's why I keep telling you the story." You scramble out of the Valley of Hinnom, lungs still smarting from phantom smoke. And now the landscape shifts into something strangely familiar, a kind of ancient fashion runway. Robes swish, jewelry glitters, people whisper about the latest cultural trends. But instead of debating whether shoulder pads are back in style, the crowd here argues whether worshipping idols is chic or shameful. The chronicler folds his arms in the corner, unimpressed. To him, this wasn't about style points. It was about eternal betrayal. You stroll along the runway, and villagers parade past with new spiritual accessories. One family brags about their fresh Asherah pole, hand-carved from imported cedar. Another proudly shows off a shiny Baal amulet dangling from their neck. It feels like a farmer's market meets a mall kiosk. Buy one fertility charm, get a rain talisman half off. You can almost hear the chronicler muttering, "Oh yes," because nothing says sophisticated like bowing to a block of wood. Mainstream fact: in the ancient Near East, idol worship often carried cultural prestige. Fertility rituals were common among Canaanites, storm gods were revered by Phoenicians, and fire offerings cropped up in Ammon. Historians still argue whether Israelites adopted these practices because they believed in their power or because they wanted to fit in with their neighbors. Peer pressure isn't just a middle school problem, it was alive and well in Jerusalem's streets. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest Asherah poles may have doubled as giant decorated trees, festooned with ribbons, carvings, or even offerings. Imagine Judahites hosting an idol-themed block party where everyone gathers around a bedazzled tree. It's like ancient Pinterest meets religious rebellion. The deeper you walk into this scene, the clearer the split becomes. For some, idol worship was trendy, like wearing the latest imported sandals. Everyone's doing it, they'd argue. For others, especially prophets and reformers, it was the ultimate betrayal, like cheating on a spouse in broad daylight. The chronicler frames it as exactly that, not cultural fashion, but covenant-breaking adultery. Here's the open scholarly debate. Were idol rituals mostly shallow fads, practiced casually, or did people deeply believe they were encountering real deities? Some argue idols functioned like lucky charms, comforting but not central. Others believe worshippers experienced them as powerful spiritual encounters. The chronicler doesn't split hairs. To him, dabbling is betrayal. Whether it's trendy or devout, you stop near a pottery booth where a merchant displays bowls painted with suns, moons, and stars. Customers gush over their cosmic designs, proudly buying them as status symbols. You chuckle, it's like bragging about your astrology mug collection today. But for the chronicler, those bowls weren't harmless, they symbolized creeping compromise. Even kitchenware became a battleground for loyalty. It hits you then. The chronicler isn't just ranting about idols because he's grumpy. He knows that every fashion choice shapes the heart. Idolatry was more than bad theology, it was lifestyle branding. To the nations around Judah, idols were how you proved you were sophisticated, modern, connected. To resist them was to risk mockery or isolation. You imagine a Judahite teenager rolling their eyes at their parents. Why can't we have a cool Asherah pole like everyone else? Peer pressure echoes through every century. And the chronicler's voice sighs back, because cool doesn't equal faithful. One last image follows you as the runway fades. A villager struts proudly with an idol figurine under one arm, smiling like they've just bought the latest gadget. But as the crowd cheers, a prophet stands at the edge, hair wild, eyes blazing, shouting, "This isn't fashion, it's betrayal." The cheers drown him out, but the chronicler writes his words down anyway, so they outlive the applause. The runway of idols fades, and now you step into a city alive with the sound of demolition. The crash of stone, the thud of wood splintering, and the startled cries of idol makers losing their business. Dust clouds rise in the streets as workers swing hammers against carved poles and topple shrines that had stood for generations. In the middle of the chaos strides King Hezekiah, robes dusty, eyes blazing, personally inspecting each smashed idol like a general checking battlefield progress. The chronicler's tone sharpens with energy here. This is one of his favorite parts of the story. You remember the pendulum swing of Judah's kings, one faithful, one faithless, back and forth like a kid on a seesaw. But Hezekiah breaks into the pattern with force. Where his father Ahaz had shut Yahweh's temple doors and cluttered the city with altars on every corner, Hezekiah swings them open again. He calls the priests back to work, relights the lamps, and tells the Levites, "Clean house every last corner." The chronicler relishes this scene, almost rubbing his hands with satisfaction as he writes, "At last, someone gets it right, mainstream fact." 2 Chronicles 29-31 gives one of the longest reform accounts in the whole book. Hezekiah doesn't just reopen the temple, he reinstitutes Passover, smashes idols across Judah, and even sends messengers into the northern tribes, inviting them back into covenant worship. Historians still argue whether his reforms were truly that sweeping, or whether the chronicler amplified them as a model of ideal kingship. Archaeological evidence suggests shrines remained in use outside Jerusalem, meaning Hezekiah's purge wasn't absolute. Still, his zeal set him apart. Here's your quirky tidbit. One of Hezekiah's most famous projects wasn't smashing idols, but digging a tunnel. Carved straight through bedrock, the Siloam Tunnel redirected water from the Gihon Spring into Jerusalem, ensuring the city wouldn't go thirsty under siege. Imagine crawling through 1,750 feet of dark, damp rock by torchlight, chiseling until you meet another team halfway. When they finally broke through, they even left a victory inscription on the wall. It's still there, like an ancient "we did it" selfie carved in stone, but back to the reforms. Picture Hezekiah walking into the temple, flinging open windows, ordering priests to scrub soot off the walls, sweeping out spider webs from years of neglect. Musicians tune harps, trumpets blare, and worship swells again. The chronicler notes how the whole city joins in, people bring offerings, sing psalms, and rediscover joy. It's a spiritual festival and spring cleaning rolled into one, and Hezekiah does something bold. He tears down the high places. Remember those household shrines scattered on hillsides and in courtyards? He orders them destroyed, no matter how beloved. One shrine even contained Moses' bronze serpent, originally built to heal snake-bitten Israelites. Over centuries, people had turned it into an idol. Hezekiah smashed it, giving it a sarcastic nickname, Nehushtan, just a piece of bronze. It's like smashing your grandma's antique teapot because people keep worshipping it instead of using it for tea. Brutal, but necessary. Here's the open scholarly debate. Was Hezekiah's reform truly nationwide, or more of a Jerusalem-centered revival? Some scholars say his authority beyond Judah's capital was limited, so rural idol practices likely survived. Others argue his reforms genuinely impacted the whole region, even inspiring neighboring tribes. The chronicler certainly portrays it as sweeping, But history suggests messy gray areas. You walk through the streets of Jerusalem during this purge, and the air is electric. On one corner, children cheer as workers topple an Asherah pole. On another, idol makers weep over their ruined livelihood, muttering curses under their breath. Prophets clap their hands with joy, finally seeing their warnings heeded. And through it all, Hezekiah presses forward, relentless, like someone on a New Year's resolution high who actually sticks with it. You chuckle, imagining the sarcasm of the chronicler as he records Ahaz's failures and then pivots to Hezekiah. See? This is what it looks like when a king has a spine. The tone isn't subtle, it's celebratory, almost triumphant. After endless cycles of compromise, Hezekiah feels like a breath of fresh air, but the chronicler also slips in realism. Not everyone joined the reform. When Hezekiah invited northern Israelites to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem, some laughed and mocked the messengers. Yet others humbled themselves and came. It's a poignant reminder. Revival always divides. Some cling to idols, some return home. The chronicler doesn't hide the mockery. He just points out that those who joined the feast found joy like never before. You pause in the temple courtyard, where singers chant psalms with voices that shake the rafters. Incense curls upward, this time untainted by idols. The chronicler's voice softens here, almost tender. For a moment, Judah remembered who they were. Hezekiah's bold purge wasn't just political cleanup, it was a spiritual reset button. And as you listen to the music swell, you realize that's why the chronicler included every detail, because sometimes, in the middle of ruins and warnings, people really do get it right. And when they do, even dusty chronicles glow with hope. The joyful psalms of Hezekiah's reforms fade, and in their place comes the heavy creak of a palace door. You step into the throne room decades later, and the air feels different, thicker, darker, almost humid with compromise. The man seated on the throne is Hezekiah's son, King Manasseh, and if you expect to chip off the old block, brace yourself. This is the whiplash moment in the chronicler's tale, a shocking reversal so extreme it almost feels like parody. The chronicler doesn't hold back. He paints Manasseh's reign as a freefall into chaos. All those idols Hezekiah smashed? Rebuilt. The Asherah poles? Set up again, this time right in the temple itself. Altars for Baal? Check. Shrines for the starry host of heaven? Double check. The chronicler makes sure you see it clearly. Manasseh doesn't just dabble in idolatry, he sprints headfirst into it. It's like cleaning out your house of every bad habit, only for your kid to refill it with junk food, trash, and a live crocodile in the bathtub for flair. Mainstream fact. Historically, Manasseh ruled for an extraordinarily long time, around 55 years, making him Judah's longest reigning king. This reign is well attested in both biblical records and Assyrian annals, which mention him as a loyal vassal. Historians still argue whether his reign was politically stable because of that loyalty or spiritually catastrophic because of his religious policies. The chronicler focuses entirely on the latter. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some rabbinic traditions claim Manasseh actually ordered the prophet Isaiah's death by sawing him in half. Gruesome bedtime material, right? Thankfully, no bedtime saws appear in Chronicles, but the legend underscores how deeply later generations viewed him as the villain of villains. Think of him as Judah's Darth Vader, except without the redemptive music swelling just yet. You stroll through Jerusalem under Manasseh's reign, and the city feels dizzying. On one corner, children play under an Asherah pole decorated with garlands. On another, incense wafts from rooftop altars dedicated to the sun, moon, and stars. In the valley below, firelight flickers, and you shiver as you remember the burning arms of Moloch. Manasseh, the chronicler says, even sacrificed his own sons there. The warning from earlier sections has now become a horrifying reality, and it doesn't stop at idols. Manasseh dives into divination, fortune-telling, necromancy, every forbidden practice the law of Moses forbade. The chronicler piles detail on detail, as though stacking evidence for a court trial. Guilty, guilty, guilty. You can almost hear him sigh. This is why exile came. Here's the open scholarly debate. Did Manasseh's religious policy represent personal devotion to paganism, or a pragmatic political strategy to align Judah with a serious cosmopolitan empire? Some argue he adopted Assyrian cults to prove loyalty and ensure survival. Others believe he genuinely embraced these deities. Either way, the chronicler doesn't give him that benefit of nuance. He just sees betrayal. The darkness grows heavier as you walk deeper. The temple itself, once scrubbed clean by Hezekiah's hands, is cluttered again with idols. Imagine walking into a cathedral and seeing slot machines lining the altar. Worshippers bow not to Yahweh, but to the stars, the sun, the moon, anything shiny and distant. The chronicler shudders as he describes it. The covenant's sacred house reduced to a cosmic flea market. You pause near a group of elders, their faces weary. Some whisper prayers to Yahweh in secret, others give in and join the idol processions. It's hard not to picture the generational whiplash, grandparents remembering Hezekiah's music-filled temple, now watching grandchildren offer incense to strange gods. The chronicler lets that irony burn without commentary, trusting you'll feel the tragedy yourself. But here comes a twist. The chronicler tells of Manasseh being dragged away by Assyrian captors, hooks in his nose, shackled like a beast. It's a humiliation fit for a king who thought himself untouchable. And there, in exile, stripped of power and pomp, Manasseh does something unexpected. He prays. He humbles himself, pleads with Yahweh, and remarkably, the chronicler says, God listens. Manasseh returns to Jerusalem, chastened, and begins to undo his own mess, tearing down idols, repairing the altar of the Lord, and urging Judah to serve Yahweh again. Historians still argue whether this repentance really happened or whether the chronicler added it as a theological lesson. The Book of Kings paints Manasseh only in the darkest tones, with no hint of reform. But the chronicler, writing after exile, seems determined to show even the worst sinner can repent. It's his bedtime story moral. No matter how far you fall, there's a way back. Quirky aside, you imagine the chronicler writing this section with a sly grin, as though saying, see? Even Darth Vader gets a redemption arc. Except in this case, the redemption feels partial, fragile, and tragically late. Because while Manasseh may have turned back, his long decades of compromise had already shaped Judah's culture. His reversal was too little, too late. You wander back into the temple after his repentance. The idols are fewer, the altar restored, but the scars remain. Stones are stained, memories linger, and the people are divided. Some cheer the king's return to Yahweh, others mutter, But weren't you the one who burned your sons? It's hard to rebuild trust once you've bulldozed it for half a century, and that's the chronicler's bittersweet point. Manasseh's reign shows the devastating impact of compromise and the faint flicker of hope and repentance. Hezekiah's bold purge brought renewal, but Manasseh's shocking reversal nearly smothered it. It's a reminder that faithfulness can be undone faster than it's built, and that warnings ignored always leave scars. You step out of the palace as twilight falls, hearing the echoes of children laughing under idol poles that were smashed, rebuilt, and smashed again. The pendulum swings back and forth, and you know the chronicler won't let you forget how much damage one reign of rebellion can cause. The darkness of Manasseh's reign clings like smoke, but as you keep walking forward, the air shifts. Somewhere deep in Jerusalem's temple district, a hammer clinks against stone, dust floats in a golden beam of light, and the echo of children's voices drifts through narrow streets. You find yourself in the days of Josiah, the boy king who took the throne at only 8 years old. At first, he is just a child wandering hallways far too large for him, sandals slapping against the marble. But years pass quickly, and by the time Josiah turns 16, something awakens. The chronicler whispers it simply. He begins to seek Yahweh. You imagine Josiah climbing the temple steps, staring at the worn-out doors his great-grandfather Hezekiah had once flung open. He sees cracks in the walls, faded paint, cobwebs curling in the rafters. The place that was supposed to shine with the presence of God looks tired, almost forgotten. And Josiah decides, no more decay. With youthful zeal, he orders repairs. Workers swarm the temple, clearing rubble, polishing bronze, patching walls. They don't expect to find anything more than dust and splinters. But tucked away in a dark corner, someone pries open a hidden chamber, and there it is, a scroll, mainstream fact. Most scholars believe this scroll was an early form of Deuteronomy, discovered during Josiah's temple renovation. It contained covenant commands long neglected, including stern warnings against idolatry. Historians still argue whether the book was genuinely ancient or composed around Josiah's time to fuel reform. Either way, its discovery became a turning point. Quirky tidbit: some rabbis later imagined that the scroll was literally Moses' original Torah, preserved by priests for centuries, then dramatically found at the perfect moment. Like pulling out an ancient family recipe card just when your household needs healing chicken soup. Whether legend or fact, the drama of discovery electrified Josiah's court. Picture the scene. The scroll is carried reverently to Shaphan the secretary, who unrolls it and begins to read. His voice trembles as he recites curses for disobedience, blessings for obedience. Josiah listens, at first stiff and formal, then slowly breaking. The chronicler lingers on this detail. Josiah tears his royal robes. It's the ultimate kingly gesture of grief. Imagine a president ripping their tailored suit on live TV out of sheer anguish. Josiah realizes that Judah, after generations of idol worship, stands on the edge of judgment. Historians still argue whether Josiah's reaction was purely religious or partly political. Was he horrified spiritually, or was he savvy enough to recognize that reform could unify a fractured kingdom? The chronicler insists it was sincere. Josiah's heart was tender, his tears real, his repentance immediate. So Josiah summons priests, prophets, and officials. Together, they visit the prophetess Huldah, who lives in Jerusalem's second quarter. Huldah doesn't mince words. She confirms the scroll's warnings. Judgment is coming for Judah's idolatry. But she also delivers a personal message for Josiah. Because he humbled himself, he will not see the full disaster in his lifetime. It's like getting a weather forecast that says, a hurricane's coming, but you'll be gone before it hits. Comforting and terrifying all at once, the reform begins in earnest. Josiah gathers the people, reads the scroll aloud, and makes a covenant before Yahweh to follow every word. Then, like Hezekiah before him, he launches a full-scale purge of idols. But Josiah goes even harder. He doesn't just smash Asherah poles, he grinds them to powder. He burns bones of false priests on their altars to desecrate them. He travels into the former northern kingdom, tearing down shrines left standing since Jeroboam's golden calves. The chronicler beams with approval. Finally, a king who not only listens but acts with fire. Imagine walking alongside Josiah's procession. Soldiers topple statues, sparks fly as poles burn, ashes swirl in the air. Children gape, elders mutter, idol sellers weep. It feels like the city is going through a detox, painful but necessary. And Josiah presses forward, sleeves rolled, determination etched on his young face. Quirky aside, one legend claims Josiah even traveled to Bethel, where he saw the very altar that centuries earlier had been cursed by a man of God in the time of Jeroboam. Josiah burns bones on that altar, fulfilling the prophecy to the letter. The chronicler loves these full-circle moments, as if to say, see? God never forgets. Here's your scholarly debate for the night. Was Josiah's reform truly embraced by the people, or was it mostly enforced from the top down? Archaeology suggests idol figurines still lingered in households long after. Some historians argue the people complied outwardly but secretly held on to old habits. Others believe Josiah sparked genuine nationwide revival. The chronicler, of course, portrays it as wholehearted, because he wants Josiah remembered as the model king. The climax of Josiah's story comes when he restores Passover. It isn't just another feast, it's described as greater than any since the days of Samuel. Imagine pilgrims streaming into Jerusalem from every tribe, lambs bleating, musicians playing, families eating unleavened bread together under lantern light. The chronicler lets the moment shine, unity, joy, worship, all anchored in covenant loyalty. For a fleeting time, Judah feels whole again. You can almost hear Josiah speaking softly to the crowd. Remember this night, remember this covenant. Don't go back. His voice carries into the night sky, over the roofs, into alleys where idols once stood. And for once, the city seems to listen, yet, in the corner of your vision, you catch the chronicler's solemn gaze. He knows the reform won't last forever. He knows that after Josiah's death, old habits will return, and exile will march closer. But here, in this section of the story, he allows you to linger in hope. To imagine what it feels like when a whole people rediscover their calling, when faith replaces fashion, when scrolls hidden in dust suddenly blaze like fire, and as you walk away from Josiah's glowing Passover feast, the chronicler's whisper lingers in your ear. One king can change everything, but only for a time. The echo of Josiah's Passover still hums in your ears, trumpets blaring, singers chanting, families feasting in the flicker of lanterns. But as you drift forward, the festival lights dim and the soundscape shifts. Instead of unified joy, You hear the clatter of doors shutting, the whisper of hidden conversations, the muffled clink of small objects being tucked away under cloaks. This is Judah after Josiah, and what you witness now is a double life. On the surface, everything looks fine. People go to the temple on holy days, they sing psalms, they bring sacrifices. Priests lift their hands, incense curls upward, the city buzzes with outward piety. But walk closer, and you notice things don't quite match. Behind one curtain, a family hides a small clay figurine shaped like a woman, an Asherah goddess tucked neatly on a shelf. Behind another door, a man whispers prayers to the stars, hoping for fortune in trade. In alleys, little offerings sit beside miniature altars carved into stone walls. The chronicler describes it bluntly: Judah honored Yahweh with lips, but hearts clung to idols. Mainstream fact: archaeological digs in Judah have uncovered hundreds of small terracotta female figurines, often associated with household Asherah worship. These suggest that, despite official reforms, private devotion to fertility gods remained widespread. Historians still argue whether these figurines represented literal deities or were symbolic charms for luck and protection. Either way, the evidence shows that ordinary families lived in spiritual split-screen mode: Yahweh in public, idols at home. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some shrines have been found with offerings of food, grains, fruits, even small cakes. Imagine sneaking into the kitchen at night, baking cookies not for your kids, but for a clay goddess who might bless your harvest. It's the ancient version of leaving milk and cookies out for Santa, except instead of presents you're hoping for rain and healthy sheep. As you wander these streets, the tension gnaws at you. Outwardly, Judah appears faithful. The temple still stands, priests still chant, and the covenant is recited. But privately, idols sit in corners, charms dangle from necks, and prayers scatter in every direction. It's spiritual multitasking, but the chronicler frames it as betrayal, like trying to keep two spouses happy without either finding out. Historians still argue whether this double life was born out of fear or convenience. Some suggest people genuinely feared abandoning traditional deities, worrying that if they ignored Baal or Asherah, their crops would fail. Others think it was about hedging bets. Why not worship both? That way we cover all our bases. Either way, the chronicler would roll his eyes. He saw it as spinelessness, a refusal to trust Yahweh fully. You pause at a courtyard where neighbors gather around a small fire. One man recites psalms from memory, his voice steady. But when he leaves, another quietly places a figurine by the embers, muttering to a goddess under his breath. The two practices coexist awkwardly, like oil and water pretending they're a smoothie. The chronicler doesn't gloss over this hypocrisy. He highlights it as the seedbed for disaster. Quirky aside, you almost imagine Judahite parents telling their kids, "Don't worry, we'll go to temple tomorrow, but tonight let's keep our lucky idol under the bed." It's bedtime stories with a double edge, part psalm, part superstition. You can practically hear the chronicler groaning in the margins. This is why exile happened, folks. The atmosphere feels heavy, like a performance no one fully believes in. Priests smile as they receive offerings, but some quietly burn incense to the stars when the crowds leave. Elders teach covenant laws, then slip into hidden rituals in their homes. Even kings after Josiah wobble between reform and compromise, trying to please factions while avoiding outright rebellion. The nation lives in two worlds, and the split tears at its soul. Here's your open scholarly debate. Was this double life unique to Judah, or just typical of the ancient Near East? Some argue every culture blended gods and practices. Judah was simply normal. Others insist Judah's uniqueness was precisely that they weren't supposed to blend. The chronicler clearly takes the second stance. Judah wasn't called to be normal. They were called to be holy. The further you wander, the sadder it feels. You remember Hezekiah's bold purge, Josiah's fiery covenant, and for a moment you wonder, did any of it matter if people just kept idols tucked in drawers? The chronicler would answer, yes, because the warnings stand. The reforms showed what faithfulness could look like, even if people refused to hold on to it. You glance up at the temple silhouetted against twilight. From a distance, it shines, a beacon of worship. But inside homes, figurines glow in lamplight, silent witnesses to divided hearts. It's like looking at someone's Instagram feed, polished, perfect, filtered, while behind the scenes, everything is fractured. Judah was posting #FaithfulLife, but their drafts folder was full of idols, and in the hush of evening, you hear the whisper of prophets calling it out. Jeremiah weeps in the streets, accusing people of honoring Yahweh with words but cheating him with actions. Ezekiel has visions of abominations hidden in temple walls. Their cries echo, "You can't fool God with a double life." The chronicler doesn't soften it. He lays it bare. Judah's downfall wasn't just fiery altars or dramatic betrayals. It was the quiet compromises in kitchens and bedrooms, the double life that eroded loyalty one figurine at a time. The kind of slow rot you barely notice until the beams collapse. You step back into the night, the city glowing faintly under the stars. Somewhere, a psalm drifts on the breeze. Somewhere else, an idol figurine catches lamplight. And you realize this is the tension that will fin all. The quiet double life of Judah weighs on you as you keep walking, and then the soundscape changes again. Instead of hidden whispers behind shuttered doors, you hear the tramp of soldiers' boots, the rattle of chains, the crackle of flames devouring timber beams. The city of Jerusalem is falling, and with it, the illusion of safety that idols once promised. Smoke curls through the sky like a funeral veil. This is exile, the bitter lesson the chronicler circles toward like a hawk over its prey. You step into the streets as Babylonian troops surge through gates. Walls crumble, stones crash, and the temple itself burns. Gold ornaments are ripped off, sacred vessels carted away, priests scattered. Families cry as they are herded together, bound for the long march east. You smell ash, sweat, and despair. For centuries, prophets had warned that idolatry would lead here. Now it isn't a warning, it's reality, mainstream fact. The Babylonian exile began with the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Thousands were deported to Babylon, where they lived for decades. Historians still argue about numbers. Was it just the elite, or large swaths of the population? Either way, Judah was gutted, its heart ripped out. Here's your quirky tidbit. Babylon was a glittering metropolis compared to Jerusalem. Exiles would have encountered ziggurats, giant step temples rising like stairways to heaven, lush gardens, bustling markets, and cosmopolitan crowds. Imagine being dragged from a modest hometown and plopped into the ancient version of New York City. Overwhelming, dazzling, and disorienting all at once. As you shuffle alongside the captives, you sense the aching contradiction. They lost their land, temple, and king, but they did not lose memory. The chronicler wants you to understand, in exile, the people finally absorbed what prophets had shouted for generations. Idols had promised protection, prosperity, and fertility, but none of them saved Jerusalem from Babylon's fire. The lesson seared itself into the collective soul. False gods are empty. Yahweh alone remains. Historians still argue whether exile was primarily punishment or purification. Some describe it as divine justice for covenant betrayal. Others see it as a painful reset button, forcing Judah to redefine identity without land or temple. The chronicler weaves both together, discipline that hurts but heals. You pause at a riverside, where captives hang their harps on willows. They cannot bring themselves to sing. The songs that once shook temple rafters now catch in their throats. Psalmists write laments here, verses soaked in tears. How can we sing Yahweh's song in a foreign land? You feel the weight of silence heavier than any Babylonian chain, but here's the strange paradox. Exile, though bitter, becomes the moment Judah finally sheds idols. Archaeological records after the exile show a dramatic drop in household figurines. The people who once lived double lives return with a singular devotion. It's like being burned once by touching a hot stove and swearing never to try again. The chronicler looks back and says, "See? That's what it took for them to understand." Quirky aside, you picture some Judahite elder in Babylon pointing at a flashy Mesopotamian idol market and muttering, "Nope. Been there, done that, bought the figurine, lost the kingdom." A tragic joke, but you get the sense they never forgot the sting. In Babylon, the people adapt. They gather in homes, create prayer circles, recite the law, and pass down stories. Without the temple, they improvise. Some scholars suggest this is the seedbed of the synagogue. In losing one form of worship, they invent another. In losing the land, they cling to memory. Their faith, pruned by fire, begins to regrow. Historians still argue whether exile was more destructive or transformative. On one hand, it was trauma, displacement, cultural loss. On the other, it solidified Jewish monotheism in a way nothing else had. The chronicler emphasizes the latter. Exile hurt, but it clarified. No more Baal, no more Asherah, no more Moloch. Just Yahweh. You picture a child born in Babylon, hearing bedtime stories not about local gods, but about Yahweh's mighty acts. Parents warn, "We lost our home because of idols." Never forget. The child nods, wide-eyed, and repeats the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It's a lullaby forged in loss, but it carries a steel edge of resolve. And then, decades later, news comes like a sunrise. Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon and allows captives to return. For the first time in a lifetime, they march not as prisoners but as pilgrims. Their steps echo with new vows, no idols this time. The chronicler lingers on this pivot. Exile breaks them, but it also remakes them. You step out of Babylon's shadow with them, the river behind you, Jerusalem's ruins ahead. The chronicler's whisper is sharp but gentle now. Idols took you here, and only Yahweh brought you back. It is the bitter lesson sealed into Judah's bones, a warning retold for generations so no one ever forgets. The march of exiles back from Babylon fades, and suddenly you're not in a bustling ancient street but crouched in a trench under a blazing sun, a trowel in hand. Dust clings to your arms, pottery shards scatter around your knees, and a professor in a wide hat calls out, "Careful, that layer's Iron Age." You blink. Welcome to the modern dig sites of Judah, where archaeology whispers secrets about idols the chronicler railed against. Mainstream fact: across Israel and Judah, archaeologists have uncovered countless artifacts that shed light on daily religious life. Among them are hundreds of small clay figurines, mostly female, often interpreted as Asherah representations. Many are headless, whether broken in antiquity or by accident during excavation. These finds complicate the neat picture the chronicler painted. They show idol worship wasn't just royal policy or fringe rebellion, it was embedded in households. Historians still argue whether these figurines were actual goddesses or protective charms, like ancient spiritual security systems. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one excavation at Tel Arad, archaeologists discovered a full-fledged temple complex dated to Judah's monarchy. Inside, 2 standing stones were found side by side in the Holy of Holies. Some suggest they symbolized Yahweh and his consort, possibly Asherah. Imagine that, a mini temple in Judah where the covenant God might have shared a spotlight with a goddess. It's like finding a secret church basement with a shrine to both Jesus and Wonder Woman. The discovery still sparks heated debates in academic conferences, and a few awkward chuckles. You crouch closer to one of those terracotta figurines. She has exaggerated features, arms folded under her chest, and no legs, just a stumpy base. To modern eyes, she looks almost cartoonish, like something a child might mold out of clay during art class. But in her time, she carried weight. Families may have prayed to her for fertility, safe childbirth, or healthy crops. To the chronicler, though, she was evidence of betrayal, a rival carved into clay. Historians still argue about the figurine's exact purpose. Were they religious idols, household decorations, or simply toys? Some insist their sheer number, found in nearly every layer of Judahite houses, proves cultic use. Others suggest women used them privately, perhaps even without official sanction. The chronicler would hardly care about the nuance. In his view, anything resembling Asherah was unacceptable. The dig continues. You brush away more dirt and uncover an inscription scratched onto a pottery shard. It reads, "Blessed be X by Yahweh and his Asherah." The phrase stuns you. Here is physical proof that, at least for some, Yahweh wasn't worshipped alone. Scholars puzzle over it. Did worshippers think Yahweh had a divine partner? Was Asherah a reference to a goddess, or to a sacred object like a pole? No consensus exists. The chronicler, though, would see it as smoking gun evidence of why exile was necessary. Quirky aside, imagine how awkward this would be for a Sunday school teacher if kids dug up their backyard and found a jar saying, "God and Mrs. God bless you." It highlights just how messy ancient faith practice really was compared to the clean lines the chronicler preferred. You climb out of the trench and walk through an archaeology lab, where shelves line up with labeled bags. Figurine, Jerusalem, incense altar, Lachish, astral seal, Megiddo. Each object is tiny, breakable, and ordinary, and yet together they tell a story. Judah wasn't a land of pure worship or pure rebellion. It was a land of blending, confusion, and contradiction. The chronicler gave the sermon version. The dirt gives the footnotes. Historians still argue about the Tel Arad temple in particular. Was it an official state-sanctioned shrine or just a rogue outpost? Was it destroyed by Hezekiah's purge or abandoned earlier? The debate rages, with pottery dating as evidence and tempers flaring in conference rooms. Meanwhile, the chronicler's verdict would be simple: it shouldn't have been there at all. You pause by a display case where a broken idol figurine sits under glass. Children press their faces to the glass, giggling at her awkward proportions. To them, she looks silly, powerless. And maybe that's the chronicler's point. When stripped of mystery and myth, idols are just fragile clay, breakable by shovel or hammer. But even so, archaeology refuses to let you dismiss them entirely. For ancient families, these little figurines carried comfort, hope, even identity. They remind you that the struggle wasn't abstract, it was lived out in kitchens, bedrooms, and backyards. Idolatry wasn't always dramatic fire altars. Sometimes it was a quiet figurine tucked on a shelf. You step back into the sun, dirt still under your nails, the whisper of history buzzing in your ears. The chronicler may have thundered warnings from his scroll, but here in the dust of Judean hills, the material evidence hums its own tune. People wrestled with divided loyalties every day. Idols weren't just theological, they were tangible, touchable, part of daily life. And it's precisely that ordinariness that made them so dangerous. The dust of archaeology still clings to your sandals when you drift forward again, but now the landscape shifts. The dig site melts into neon lights, car horns, buzzing phones, and billboards the size of houses. You're not brushing clay from ancient figurines anymore. You're scrolling your feed at midnight, battling the glow of endless notifications. And just like that, the chronicler's warnings against Baal, Asherah, and Moloch no longer feel like distant museum exhibits. They echo in modern streets, buzzing in earbuds, even whispering from glowing screens. You blink and chuckle, because at first it sounds absurd. How can ancient storm gods and fertility poles matter in a world of credit cards and TikTok dances? But give it a beat, and you notice the eerie parallels. Baal promised rain, prosperity, and security for farmers. Today, whole industries promise the same: buy this product, sign up for that plan, hustle until you're rich, and everything will be fine. Asherah offered intimacy, fertility, and beauty. Look around, and you see endless ads, apps, and influencers selling idealized bodies and romance fantasies. Moloch demanded the unthinkable: children through fire. And yet, in a quieter, less literal way, society still sacrifices its young: overwork, neglect, cycles of violence, digital addictions that erode childhood. The names change, the altars look different, but the spirit? Familiar mainstream fact: modern scholars of religion often describe idolatry not only as bowing to statues but as misplacing ultimate trust, treating something finite as if it were infinite. Money, fame, beauty, even nationalism can become functional gods. Historians still argue whether this broader definition stretches the term too far or makes it more useful for modern readers. Either way, the chronicler's ancient warning maps neatly onto today's obsessions. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 2018, an artist built a literal golden calf sculpture and paraded it on Wall Street as performance art. People snapped selfies with it, laughed, and shared it online. It was satire, sure, but the resemblance was almost too perfect. The line between parody and prophecy blurred. leaving you wondering if ancient warnings weren't so outdated after all. You wander through a shopping mall, air-conditioned and glossy. Every corner screams with slogans, "You need this now, upgrade your life, because you're worth it." It feels almost like a liturgy, chants promising salvation through possessions. You pause by a mannequin, plastic arms posed just so, and wonder if Asherah would have fit right in here, only now draped in high fashion. Historians still argue whether it's fair to equate modern consumer culture with ancient idolatry. Some say the analogy risks oversimplifying complex economic systems. Others insist the comparison is powerful precisely because it's uncomfortable. Either way, the chronicler's voice would probably lean in, lower to a whisper, and say, "You see what I mean, don't you?" You pass a cafe where people bend over laptops, earbuds in, eyes glazed by glowing rectangles. It hits you like a quiet joke. Baal used thunder, but today's gods use Wi-Fi signals. Both invisible, both powerful, both dictating your daily rhythms. And if the router goes down, honestly, don't you feel a little like ancient farmers watching the sky for rain? Quirky aside, imagine explaining Instagram to an ancient prophet. Yes, Isaiah, people will scroll endlessly looking at strangers' meals, gym selfies, and cats. No, it doesn't rain afterward. He'd probably tear his robe on the spot, but beneath the laughter, there's weight. The chronicler's caution wasn't about silly statues, it was about misplaced devotion. When hearts leaned on idols, society rotted, leaders grew corrupt, justice warped, children were harmed, truth blurred. Scroll through the news today, and you see similar patterns. Technology itself isn't evil, but worshipping at its altar, treating it as ultimate, produces the same kind of unraveling. You turn a corner into a quiet park. Children play on swings, their laughter sharp against the city noise. And here the parallel grows sharper. Moloch's shadow still lingers, not in bronze altars but in systemic ways societies gamble with the next generation. Whether through neglect, environmental damage, or violent cycles, the young often pay the cost for adults' obsessions. It isn't fire-lit arms now, it's subtler, but no less real. Historians still argue how to responsibly apply ancient warnings to modern contexts. Should Chronicles remain locked in history, or should it act like a mirror, reflecting back uncomfortable truths? The debate rages in lecture halls, sermons, and podcasts. But in this park, with laughter fading into evening air, you feel the chronicler tugging your sleeve, urging you not to brush it off as just history. You sit on a bench, noticing your own phone buzzing. Notifications demand attention, like miniature prophets of distraction. You smile wryly, because even here, the call of modern idols won't quit. But you also notice the chronicler's consistent heartbeat. Idols never deliver what they promise. Whether Baal's storms or your phone's dopamine hits, the result is the same temporary satisfaction followed by deeper hunger. Quirky aside, you remember the crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier. Compared to modern miracle creams and beauty serums, maybe it wasn't so far off. Ancient or modern, people will smear almost anything on themselves if told it'll fix insecurity. That's the Asherah pull, promises of beauty and belonging wrapped in strange packaging. The chronicler's warning lingers like a sigh. Don't trade the eternal for the shiny. Don't confuse the infinite with the marketable. In every era, the temptation to bow, whether literally or metaphorically, persists. You stand up, brushing off the park bench, aware that Baal, Asherah, and Moloch never truly disappear, they just change outfits. The neon park lamps fade, and the buzz of city noise dissolves into a quiet hum. You're no longer scrolling, shopping, or smirking at modern idols. You're standing in the dim glow of a scribe's chamber, centuries ago. The chronicler bends over his parchment, quill scratching as oil lamps sputter. You realize why he's writing, why he insists on retelling stories already known from Kings and Samuel. It isn't just history, it's a sermon woven into narrative. He wants his community, and, strangely, you, to remember why idolatry nearly unraveled everything. You lean closer and see the ink strokes, lists of kings, temple rituals, genealogies. Dry at first glance, but beneath the surface pulses a plea. Every mention of Baal, Asherah, and Moloch isn't just about ancient gods, it's about human weakness, repeated again and again. The chronicler highlights kings who smashed idols, reforms that restored worship, and disasters that followed compromise. He edits, emphasizes, and reshapes the story, not to lie, but to hammer home one warning: stray from Yahweh, and ruin follows. Mainstream fact: most scholars date Chronicles to the post-exilic period, around the 4th century BCE. By then, the people had returned from Babylon, rebuilt the temple, and were redefining their identity. Historians still argue whether the chronicler wrote mainly as historian, theologian, or political advisor. His selective storytelling, downplaying David's sins, omitting some messy politics, suggests he wasn't neutral. He was preaching through history, urging faithfulness. Here's your quirky tidbit. The chronicler sometimes writes with almost obsessive detail about temple musicians. He records names of harpists, cymbal bangers, and gatekeepers with as much care as he describes battles. Some scholars joke that maybe he himself was a temple choir member, sneaking his passion project into scripture. It's like if someone today wrote a national history but dedicated 3 chapters to the marching band. Charming, a little nerdy, and very human, you keep reading over his shoulder. You notice how he lingers on reformers like Hezekiah and Josiah, making them almost larger than life. To him, these weren't just kings, they were blueprints. Smash the idols, restore the temple, honor Yahweh, and blessing follows. He doesn't waste ink on the small-time idol rituals of common folks. His focus is on leaders, because he knows power ripples outward. When kings compromised, people suffered. When kings stood firm, people thrived. The lesson: leadership matters in spiritual health. Historians still argue whether Chronicles was received as encouragement or critique. Was it meant to boost morale after exile, saying, "See, we're chosen again if we're faithful"? Or was it a thinly veiled warning, a reminder that even now, after Babylon, compromise could creep back? The ambiguity remains, but the urgency is clear. You step back, watching the chronicler pause, stretch his fingers, and blow gently on the ink to dry it. He doesn't know you're there, but you sense his heartbeat in every line. Remember. Don't repeat it. Learn. The warning is ancient, but your mind flickers back to malls, glowing screens, Wall Street calves, and playground swings. The parallels refuse to fade. Quirky aside, imagine the chronicler suddenly glimpsing your era. He'd probably freak out at vending machines. They're idols that give food when you feed them coins, and Wi-Fi routers, invisible power that controls households. But once he calmed down, he'd nod knowingly. Ah, same gods, new costumes. The chronicler finishes his scroll, sets it aside, and exhales. For him, history isn't nostalgia, it's scaffolding. He builds a frame strong enough to hold his community's fragile identity. And he builds it with warnings against idols, because he knows nothing corrodes faster than misplaced devotion. You realize that's why his retelling lingers where it does, why Chronicles exists at all. You close your eyes, letting the hum of that lamplit room fade into silence. The chronicler's pen stops, but his caution keeps echoing. Don't bow to Baal's promises, whether rain or money. Don't lean on Asherah's illusions, whether fertility polls or curated Instagram feeds. Don't sacrifice to Moloch, whether bronze fires or the quiet ways children are consumed by systems of neglect. The script is old, but it keeps replaying, and then the scene softens. The ink dries, the quill rests, the lamps dim. The warning doesn't vanish, but it quiets. Instead of thunder, it becomes a gentle hum, something you can carry without fear. Now the story loosens its grip. The sharp lines of kings, prophets, idols, and exiles blur into softer edges. You sit not in a ruined temple or a glowing city, but in your own quiet room, with shadows stretching gently across the walls. The chronicler's stern voice fades into something more like a lullaby, a reminder rather than a rebuke. The idols retraced through history, Baal with his storms, Asherah with her carved poles, Moloch with his burning arms, are no longer fire-lit threats at your doorstep. They've become symbols, signposts, gentle nudges to stay awake in a world full of distractions. The chronicler's warning lingers, yes, but it no longer feels heavy. It feels steady, like a railing you can lean against in the dark. You breathe slower now. The buzz of modern idols, phones, noise, demands, can wait until tomorrow. For now, the only sound you need is the quiet hum of air, the steady rhythm of your breath, maybe the faint tick of a clock nearby. The journey has carried you through temples and trenches, marketplaces and modern streets. You've walked alongside prophets, kings, exiles, and archaeologists. And now you're here, where the story doesn't demand action, only rest.so. Let your shoulders sink. Let your eyelids grow heavier. Imagine the chronicler's scroll finally rolled shut, tied with a simple cord, stored away on a wooden shelf. The lesson remains, but you don't have to wrestle with it tonight. It will be there tomorrow, steady and waiting. For now, you can drift. The warnings have softened into whispers, and the whispers into quiet. You are safe, held, and gently rocked by the rhythm of history's long story. Sleep is near. Sweet dreams.